we want to talk about moving from the pain of pandemic to the potency of pleasure. But more than that, we want to talk about why the potency of pleasure is actually, in the longer arc of history, the only preventative to the future pain and peril, right, of all of the promised pandemics of the future, which will surely come if we don't actually come together this summer and actually participate as evolutionary mystics, as social activists, and articulating a new source code to culture. And core to the new source code of culture is to identify our understanding of human motivation. We're driven by pleasure, but we don't know what pleasure is. Imagine for a second that you don't have a deep experience of pleasure. You don't know how to get pleasure, because pleasure is a skill. And there's 22 principles of pleasure. We're going to talk about each one. But more than that, those 22 principles apply across a field of 6 levels of pleasure. But imagine you don't know any of that either. And you don't know the distinction between authentic pleasure and counterfeit pleasure. So imagine that you are, like virtually all of the world today, you're lost in level 1 counterfeit pleasure. Oh my God. You're in level 1 counterfeit pleasure, which seems exciting. That's what you're driven for: status and profit and being envied by your neighbors and having enough, economic structure to allow you to take a vacation. But actually, all of those things leave you feeling empty. All of those things leave you feeling vapid. All of those things leave you feeling like, what's this all really about? And that feeling's hard, it's painful. So what you do is you try and be more successful. You keep pursuing success in whatever that superficial version of success is. Now, it's not just you doing it. A system operates according to first principles. What we understand in complexity theory is that the first principles that drive a system, when you iterate them up and down the system, you exponentialize them through the system, they create the fabric of your society, right? Our society is what we would call in metamodern theory today a hyperobject, meaning it's not made up of any particular constituent: the global economy, the pandemic, the Me Too crisis. All of these are hyperobjects constituted by literally thousands of factors that are all driven by the simple first principles that drive the society. Now, at the core of the simple first principles is the principles of pleasure. It's how do I understand pleasure? How do I experience pleasure? What gives me pleasure? Actually, and track with me for a second, it's gorgeous. One of the primary tragedies in reality that defines the emptiness of the pleasure principles is called addiction. And addiction, by the way, is shooting way up during the pandemic, even as we're cutting resources all over the world for treatment of addiction. So addiction is going to spike beyond imagination. But what is addiction? Addiction is the inability to derive pleasure from my life, from ordinary, gorgeous human activity. That's what addiction means. And so because I feel empty, I've got to get a higher hit of dopamine. I got to raise the ante. I need a little more glitz and a little more glitter and a little more exterior success. That's addiction. What's enlightenment? Enlightenment is the ability to get maximal pleasure from ordinary activity. So the addict can't derive pleasure from ordinary life. The enlightened one is blown away, loved open by pleasure derived from ordinary life. Wow, that's stunning. Now, the entire structure of our society is an addictive society at its very core. All the structures of marketing, all the structures of information move towards bottom line win-lose metrics, profit loss statements, which actually commodify our attention, social media, the attention economy, commodify our emptiness, commodify our sense of meaninglessness in order to give us hits of pseudo-eros, to give us the illusion of being filled up and pleasured. But actually, we don't feel pleasure. We still feel empty, so we got to get more of it. So we raise the bar. That's the core of a pandemic society. And it's not just a metaphor, it's absolutely real. We knew that this pandemic was coming for the last 5 years. For the last 8 months, already in December, we had very clear indication of what was happening. But no one spoke up. All through the systems of government around the world that had initial indications, people were afraid because they were driven by win-lose metrics. You don't speak up, you can't risk your job, you can't risk your success. I'll avoid it. We'll somehow be able to bypass it. Only the poor people will suffer. If you go look at the list of factors that happened in December of 2019, in January of 2020, in February of 2020, right, in March of 2020, those 4 months are a series of superficial, shallow, narcissistic playings of win-lose metrics on the part of thousands of people who are ordinary, decent, good people, but driven by the superficial pleasure principles of win-lose success story. And that's how the pandemic raged through the world. Had we had a different vision of pleasure, right? What's the pleasure of communion? What's the pleasure of meaning? What's the pleasure of unique self-creativity? What's the pleasure of enlightenment? Right? You begin to see what's the pleasure of unique self-symphony? What's the pleasure of an eros larger than you can possibly imagine? All those pleasures aren't available. So we're left with the most pseudo-erotic surface pleasures, and we claw and grasp and crave them desperately. And that is the direct line to pandemic. This summer, we're not escaping pandemic into some superficial hedonistic world, right, of bad ice cream and cheap sex, right? Not even online sex, because we're not going to be in person. We're going into the sensual. We're going into the deepest eros. We're going into transformed visions of sexuality, transformed visions of meaning, transformed visions of spirit, in which pleasure explodes in a way that honors the basic dignity of the human being. Now, here's the last thing. Pleasure's driving the whole story. Quantum hedonism is a term used by one scientist. That is at the very quantum level of reality. Reality is driven by pleasure. The entire quantum world lives in us. We are driven by pleasure, but we are the evolution of pleasure. And the evolution of pleasure is the evolution of politics. It's the evolution of society. And it's the evolution of love. So if you want to be potent, if you want to be daring, if you want to be ethical and understand that pleasure is the source of ethics, if you want to be a social activist, and if you want to blow your heart open with the dignity, the gorgeous dignity of pleasure, which is the most transformative force that exists in reality, let's come together this summer and let's love this open. Let's pleasure each other's hearts and minds and embodied forms and the embodiment of reality itself, so that actually the world after this 7 days is not the same as it was before. We're going to enter into the source code as evolutionaries, as revolutionaries of political pleasure, because pleasure is politics and politics is pleasure. There's no distinction between them. Let's do this.